This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
Despite initial difficulties, by August of 1944, the Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and established a second front with the invasion of southern France. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Armies were in full-on retreat, and Paris was liberated by August 25th. But there was a problem. Some 250,000 German troops had been left behind in the heavily defended Channel ports. With all the glory to the front, the 1st Canadian Army, facing manpower and supply issues, and in a campaign that was overshadowed by virtually everything else going on in the war, was given the unsung task of clearing the Channel ports. The last operation of that campaign, Operation Undergo, began on September 22nd. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Look, I know I've talked to you about Incogni before, but it's because this is just how reality is in this world. If you're getting these phishing emails or phone calls or texts, they can customize those to you because they have your personal information probably purchased from one of these data brokers. Even if they're customizing ads, that's all done without your permission. It's not just manipulation. It's a violation of your privacy. Totally without your permission, virtually anybody can get your personal data. An employer, a landlord, just a random stranger can find out personal details, and you have a right to control your personal information.
And you can with Incogni. It's a convenient tool that tracks down those information brokers that collect and sell your private information and enforces your right to have that information taken down. I can always see what Incogni is doing on my handy dashboard, and look at this growing line. That means it's continuing to protect me against new threats all the time. I love that Incogni protects my private information, and now they have new ways to do it with unlimited friends and family plans and a great new custom removal tool where you can point to any People search site or other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
So take your private information seriously, and it's easy to do. Just go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy to get an exclusive offer of 60% off.
The 1st Canadian Army was constituted in 1942 with the goal of keeping the Canadian contribution to the war effort together, although divisions were detached in 1942 for the disastrous raid on Dieppe, and in 1943 2 divisions and an armored brigade were sent to the Italian front so that Canadian troops could see action. Because the existence of an identifiably Canadian Army was important at home, the Canadian Encyclopedia explains, Allied formations were added to 1st Canadian Army to keep it up to strength. Thus, despite its name, the 1st Canadian Army included British, Polish, American, Belgian, Royal Netherlands, and Czechoslovakian units. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade were detached in May 1944 to become part of the Normandy Assault Force under the British 1st Corps, given primary responsibility for the beach called Juno. The 1st Canadian Army, under the command of General Henry Duncan Graham Crerar, became operational on July 23, 1944, part of the British 21st Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On August 16th, Montgomery tasked Crerar with destroying German forces in the Pas-de-Calais and Flanders and to capture the Belgian port of Antwerp. Military historian J.T. Kopp explained in his 2006 book Cinderella Army, The Canadians in Northwest Europe, that Montgomery underestimated the degree of enemy resistance likely at the Seine-Boulogne-Rouen and ignored the presence of large, well-organized enemy forces on the Channel coast. The reason, Kopp explains, was presumably because Montgomery thought the war would be won by a rapid thrust to the Rhine. Montgomery believed that Germany would be defeated by a quick thrust. The Imperial War Museum writes, Field Marshal Montgomery believed that the Allies should employ one bold stroke to shorten the war. His plan, Operation Market Garden, would put the Allies across the Rhine on Germany's frontier in a few days, and possibly end the war by Christmas, 1944. But the 1st Canadian Army wouldn't be part of the thrust. Canadian Soldier Online notes, after breaking out of Normandy, Field Marshal Montgomery was focused on his quest to cross the Rhine, and to that end, the Canadian Army was assigned a minor role in the grand scheme of Allied strategy. The role was to clear the French and Belgian coast of German fortifications and remain in the general area of Bruges-Calais until the maintenance situation allows employment further forward. This minor role, however, was of critical importance, as supply was becoming a significant issue. Historian Angus Brown wrote in his 2009 book Footsteps of the 1st Canadian Army, the Allies were faced now with a worsening supply situation. Even in September, most of the logistics requirements, supplies, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements were still coming to the continent through the D-Day beaches and ports. As units advanced farther and farther, some Allied divisions had been deliberately immobilized so that their transport units could be used for transporting material. Ports that had already been seized were not sufficient capacity to sustain the logistical flow needed. Many docks were damaged and unusable. The supply bottleneck was having an effect on the ability of all the Allied frontline troops to continue to push at the front. The clearing of the Channel ports was more than a mopping up operation. It was vital to Montgomery's plan. Canadian Soldier Online explains. Montgomery felt that with enough supplies, and he would need at least one port in the Pas-de-Calais area to provide that, he could win the war in 1944 with a single thrust over the Rhine. But on September 4th, an unprepared German defense had been caught off guard by the rapid advance of the British 11th Army, and the Belgian port of Antwerp had fallen, virtually intact. But this didn't make the task of the 1st Canadian Army irrelevant. Rather, Brown explains, while the city's docks previously had been captured more or less intact, Antwerp was useless as a gateway port to Europe because German garrisons controlled the 200 miles of approaches along the Scheldt estuary waterway from positions on the Belgian and Dutch territory along the banks. The Germans still manned defensive fortifications and massive coastal guns along the Channel coast that could attack shipping, cutting off the line of supply through Antwerp. To make use of the new port, Quer's 1st Canadian Army had to clear the Channel coast and Scheldt estuary of its German defenders. It would not be easy. Brown explains that during its eastward withdrawal, the German 15th Army actually reinforced the Scheldt garrisons as they dropped off ammunition, weapons, and sometimes complete units. Moreover, he writes, on September 4th, the day Antwerp fell, Hitler had declared that the Channel ports of Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk were to be considered fortresses, to be defended to the end. This minor role, played by the 1st Canadian Army, would become much more difficult, as Brown explains. Until this time, indications had been that the garrisons were small and not well equipped to withstand an attack. This changed rapidly, and German defensive preparations were stepped up. To make things worse, the 1st Army faced its own problems of supply. Historian Mark Zulke explains in a 2017 edition of the Canadian military history magazine Legion. Montgomery wanted the French ports opened, but he could not fully supply 1st Canadian Army while providing sufficient materiel for Market Garden. So 1st Canadian Army was put on a strict ammunition and fuel diet. As a result, the Canadians nicknamed themselves the Cinderella Army, not only undersupplied, but given the unglamorous port-clearing task, while British and American troops swarmed towards Germany. One result, Brown explains, is that important resources would have to be carefully managed in the coming battles, and that meant that offensives would have to be executed consecutively and not concurrently. This was especially true of support for the attacks and specialized equipment to assist the troops in getting their objectives. It was against this backdrop that the 1st Canadian Army moved to clear the ports. The campaign had started with a symbolic victory. In August of 1942, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division had been the main force in an attack on the French port of Dieppe. The purpose of the raid had been to gather intelligence, but also to test the feasibility of an attack on a defended port. The raid had been a disaster. Nearly 1,000 Canadians had been killed and twice that number captured. The story was different in 1944, as Zulke explains. Despite orders to fight to the last man, the German garrison at Dieppe, France, withdrew before the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division arrived on September 1st. On September 3rd, a victory parade was held to celebrate the liberation of the city. Quer attended personally. Canadian Army newsreel crowed, Dieppe, 1944, the 2nd Canadian Division returns in triumph to the scene of their martyrdom. The port facilities were largely intact, but the port was simply too small to solve Allied supply problems. However, Zulke writes, the other French ports, Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk, remained heavily defended, each requiring besieging with support from most of the 21st Army Group's heavy and medium artillery regiments and the 79th British Armoured Division's specialized equipment. The port at Le Havre was taken by the British 1st Corps, part of the 1st Canadian Army, September 10th to 12th, in what was called Operation Estonia. Le Havre was a much larger port than Dieppe, and the 1st Corps was assisted by air and naval bombardment in a combined arms attack and strategy designed to exploit weaknesses quickly. The garrison was defeated with surprisingly little Allied loss. Zulke writes, September 11th saw methodic elimination of German strongpoints outside the city, and the following day the British mopped up with vigor. By 10 p.m., slightly more than 48 hours after the attack started, the last outpost fell. Historian Lionel Ellis reported the capture of 11,300 German prisoners for fewer than 500 Allied casualties. The same strategy would be used on the other Channel ports. But even though they were larger, the port facilities had been systematically destroyed by the Germans. Even worse, as far as Montgomery was concerned, is that Allied planners placed the port in the American zone. Montgomery would need to capture another port to supply his grand thrust. What's more, owing to supply and logistical issues, the First Corps would stay in Le Havre. Boulogne proved more difficult. The attack would be undertaken by 2 brigades of the 3rd Canadian Division in what was called Operation Well Hit. It was a difficult target, Zelke explains. The city's defenses were anchored on 2 heights, Mont-Lambert and Herkelinge, both more than 150 meters high and studded with gun emplacements protected by trenches, weapon pits, and pillboxes. The defensive system was deep, with mutually supporting strongpoints often linked by underground passages. Several large coastal guns could fire inland. Wire and minefields blocked all approaches. The garrison numbered about 10,000. That was a daunting number, as the available forces of the 3rd Division only numbered 7,000. The attack commenced on September 17th with a massive air attack of some 800 bombers, followed by an artillery barrage. Notably, Montgomery's rapid thrust, the push to quickly reach the Rhine called Operation Market Garden, had begun the same day. The defense at Boulogne-en-Mer was more determined than Le Havre had been. At a critical juncture, a French civilian showed the Canadian infantry a secret entrance to a central citadel that would otherwise have been very difficult to assault. 200 Germans surrendered. After what was described as murderous fire, the port finally fell. Zucli explains the 6-day battle ended with 9,517 prisoners taken. Allied casualties numbered 634. Canada's 6th Infantry Battalion suffered the most, with 462 killed or wounded. Again, however, the port facilities were largely destroyed, and even more, the fortifications and heavy guns around Calais could target the city. Smoke had been used to screen the attack, but in the long run, CanadianSoldiers.com writes, even if the port of Boulogne could be repaired quickly, the facilities were useless until German batteries at Cap Gris-Nez and Calais were reduced. One last operation would be needed to clear the Channel ports. Operation Undergo. The website Liberation Route Europe writes, the Western Allies, following the breakout from Normandy region, France, still required deep water ports to allow logistic supplies to be unloaded closer to the front line as it advanced eastward. Le Havre had been captured by British forces on 14 September 1944, and Boulogne by Canadian forces on 22 September. The Canadian forces continued the advance on the long left flank, now headed for Calais. And resources and manpower were still thin. Brown writes, the same 3rd Division troops that undertook Boulogne would do the Calais job. Operation Undergo, the capture of Calais and Cap Gris-Nez, was given to 3rd Canadian Division, even while the formation was involved in the Boulogne attacks. While he notes that the German garrison was about 7,500, but composed of low-grade troops, he continues, on the other hand, landward defenses were extensive, with coastal guns that could fire inland, along with mines, wire, flooded and naturally marshy ground, machine gun and artillery positions. CanadianSoldiers.com writes, Calais was a well-defended city, protected by marsh and flooded ground, the inner city surrounded by an inner ring of fortifications and a network of canals, with a central citadel protected by a moat. Aerial reconnaissance identified 42 heavy gun batteries in the coastal zone around Calais. Following the same combined arms strategy, the attack began with massive bombardment. Aerial bombardment began on September 20th, before the capture of Boulogne was complete. 600 aircraft dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on Calais defenses. However, further air attacks were prevented by bad weather. CanadianSoldiers.com writes that since the air observation planes were committed to Boulogne, serious counter-battery work did not take place until the operation began, and by then the full weight of the available artillery, 8 medium regiments plus the divisional artillery, were on grid, ready to support the attack. Throughout the campaign, the 1st Canadians had depended upon armor support from the British 79th Armoured Division, a division of specialized tanks that had been designed for the Normandy invasion. Numerous types of armor designed for laying bridges, flails used for clearing mines, flame tanks called crocodiles, and engineering tanks with massive mortars called petards were designed to take out fortifications. The 79th had been used throughout the campaign, and the operations largely had to operate consecutively rather than concurrently because these tanks would need to be redeployed to support each assault. That was no different at Calais. 2nd Lieutenant James Waring of the 141st Royal Armoured Corps of the 79th Armoured Division was there. 2 companies of Canadian infantry from the North Shore Regiment commenced the action Operation Undergo to capture the 16-inch guns at Noirmont-Sanguet on September 26, 1944. I commanded a small detachment of flails, crocodiles, and petard tanks assigned to the operation from 79th Armored Division. Waring noted that the attack took place the day after the decision had been made to withdraw what was left of the 1st British Airborne Division from Arnhem, meaning that Operation Market Garden had failed, making the opening of the ports even more critical. The guns at Calais had been used to bombard the British city of Dover since its capture in 1940. Wearing rights at the night of the 26th, they chose to fire 16 rounds from the left-hand gun to Dover in a last act of defiance, and we could feel the heat waves from each shot. The action started an hour after daylight, with RAF sending in a huge assault with crater-forming bombs over the whole area. As a result, a whole hillside came down on Germans hidden in tunnels and forts around the guns. The accuracy was such that not a single bomb went astray over the bomb line designed to protect us. I sent the flails in first, but most of the hidden landmines had already been exploded or thrown up by the RAF. The beach defenses responded with 88mm and mortar fire, so I went forward to the crest with my flame-throwing crocodile. On reaching the crest, a lucky shot from Calais destroyed one of my tracks, and another hit the crocodile behind. I was on the other side of the tank and was blown into a crater. These were lucky shots because the Germans in Calais could not see us. The medics checked me out and I was okay apart from temporary deafness, which may have contributed to the permanent deafness I have suffered for many years now. I was too far away to use the flamethrower, but I got the 75mm gun into action. My gunner was brilliant, knocking out an 88mm in a mortar position near the sea with his first 2 rounds. This was significant as they'd been firing a torrent at the Canadian infantry storming down the slopes to the forts. However, we were giving more than we were receiving, and by mid-morning some Germans came out of the forts to surrender. Their own side immediately mowed them down, and the battle continued. An hour or so later, we brought the petard tanks into view on the crest, and this ended the German resistance. I went down the hill with the Canadian colonel to accept the surrender of their commander, a young captain. White flags were flying from each of the forts, but it was still not quite over. Sappers were sent in to find and destroy any demolition charges before we allowed the Germans to leave. We found that they had planned to blow up all 3 forts with booby traps and take out as many of us as possible. Waring's description fit the entire battle. While hard fought, none of the strong points held to the end, and most surrendered as soon as heavy weapons or flame vehicles were brought up. Zilke notes a particular attack on the 27th. The regimental diarist of the Winnipeg Rifles described an attack on Fort Noulet of Calais Citadel, constructed in the 16th century, as an unusual battle where all the signs of modern warfare assembled to capture an ancient fort with stone wall, a moat, and a drawbridge. The defense ended, Rifleman Harold Prout recalled, when engineers were able to bring up WASPs, flamethrower-equipped versions of the ubiquitous universal carrier. We just burst through and the WASPs started to burn everything in sight. A surrender quickly followed. A bombing raid on the 28th compelled the German commander to request a ceasefire to evacuate some 20,000 French civilians still in the city. During that truce in the city, Brown writes, the remaining brigade of 3rd Division executed a quick and effective attack against the gun batteries at Cap Grenay. On September 29th, preceded by bombing attacks during the previous 2 days, 2 battalions chopped up the outlying batteries, and then the control center and headquarters at a cost of just 42 casualties. When hostilities resumed on the 30th, he writes, the defense crumbled. The Cinderella campaign of the clearing of the Channel ports was completed on the 30th. Waring noted, the Canadians were quite crazy when it came to celebrating. We found a well-stocked wine cellar in the complex of forts, so we were able to assist them on this occasion. The Allies decided that the last port, Dunkirk, was too heavily defended and simply isolated it, with troops of the 1st Czechoslovak Armored Brigade maintaining a siege. The garrison didn't surrender until the end of the war. In addition to capturing the Channel ports, the campaign captured many of the sites that the Germans had used to launch V-1 and V-2 rockets.
The campaign to clear the Channel ports is largely forgotten today, and in some ways it accomplished little. Like other ports, the port at Calais had been largely destroyed, and the ports that were captured produced such little input of supply that it did little to alleviate Allied supply problems. A difficult campaign to clear the Dutch Scheldt estuary of German defenses was still necessary in order to safely use the port facilities at Antwerp, whose large and largely intact facilities would finally ease those Allied supply problems. In the end, Hitler's port fortresses did not, as he had ordered, hold to the last man. They were largely defended by inferior troops. But still, the 1st Canadian Army had taken on numerous heavily defended positions in a series of battles that were necessary in order to prevent those coastal batteries from attacking whatever shipping would have gone to Antwerp. And they did that with limited manpower, limited fuel, limited ammunition, and limited glory. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo.